Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this September 10th edition of Keystroke Live. As we were just saying, we do have new log-on credentials. Looks like everybody here found those. I don't know if there's some people not here that didn't find them, but be sure to keep up with that as we're sending out new emails, and I apologize for the confusion last week. But this week we have Ed I said it before, Mastrangelo from Merchant Warehouse, who is their kind of PCI EMV guru, and he is going to shed some of his knowledge and expertise to us today. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Ed.
All right, thanks. And you know, with all the announcements that Apple made yesterday, I'm really excited to be talking to you guys about security and compliance today. It's definitely just as exciting as everything Apple is doing. That said, you know, there are some things to know as there's changes that are happening at the end of this year that are not merchant warehouse changes. They are industry changes. So, you know, Visa and MasterCard are going to enforce this. So I think it's good to know. Apologies in advance. This deck is a little bit wordy, but there are some changes that I think it's important for folks to know, and there's some things that are there for interpretation. So, you know, I told that this is a deck that is for you to share. No means do I need it to be the absolute please recommend
Oh.
Can be kind of
I'm having some trouble hearing Ed. Can anybody hear him?
Well, yeah, I can hear.
I'm trying to see if muting out some folks helps.
Yeah,
okay.
That works. Thanks, Dave.
Okay, go ahead, Ed.
Is that better? After the guidance, can we just jump right in? Or
That's a little better. Jump right in.
Much
All
better.
right. So if we can just go to the next slide, and for people that might not have heard, I just said this is a little verbose, but we want you to be able to use this as a tool if we can share it afterwards. So, you know, what is PCI DSS? You know, a few years ago, the Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council says we really need to start building standards around accepting payments so that we can improve security. It's enforced by the card brands and the merchant banks, and it applies to all merchants who accept any credit or debit card, regardless of size or number of transactions. So when I say that, even merchants that are on Square doing 3 transactions a year are technically required to do an annual assessment of their business to validate compliance. First Data has their Square-like product called Pogo, and they actually built in a questionnaire that merchants have to at least sign off on once a year just so First Data can cover themselves. You know, Square and some people don't care about it, but technically this applies to everyone, mandated by the card brands and the banks. So if we can jump to the next slide, we can go into a little bit more of what that means. Ooh, I didn't even realize we had animated graphics. So what does validating compliance mean to PCI? It's protecting the network systems. You know, what are you guys doing about passwords and security? Someone might have a default point of sale system that has the password admin, you know, or username admin, you know, password, and that's just something that is done to make installation easy. But then it's up to the merchant. They have to go in and change that. And, you know, PCI has some rules and recommendations about how often and, you know, what the password strength should be. It's about protecting cardholder data. You know, how is it processed? How is it accepted and stored? And sometimes that leads to new revisions of hardware requirements for, you know, PIN entry devices. We've gone from PCI PED 1.0 we're up to 3.0 starting at early next year. It's what are merchants doing to regularly update their software and antivirus checks on the point of sale. So a lot of these are Windows-based systems, and just like your PC will tell you to update the flash player or certain drivers based on new threats that are found, merchants should be doing the same thing. And then creating policies about background checks for employees, training them, how to protect data, but then identifying and authenticating the users and making sure that people only have access to what they need, and then consistently monitor and test to ensure that everything works the way it's supposed to. So it's basically, a checklist of things that you should do to ensure that you're properly accepting and securing credit card data. I liken this to if you buy your dream house after you hit the lottery and you build up, you buy a plot of land and you start with nothing, you're probably going to do an alarm system. If it's a nice place, you might do cameras, you might have guard dogs, you might have a fence around it. I want a big giant moat, but I'm greedy. But, this is kind of the checklist of things that you should do. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean you're absolutely secure, because even if I build my dream house with that alarm system and fence, if I leave the gate open, the window open, the alarm system off, and a bunch of cash on the kitchen table, I have all those checks and balances in place, but, some crook's still going to see that bag of cash and take it. So that's kind of why they go back and say you should still monitor and test things to make sure they work, because, even if you have all these controls, if they're not implemented, you're not really keeping the merchant data safe. So that's kind of why PCI does this. So, if you jump to the next slide, the idea is a merchant has to basically fill out a form every year, and it just asks questions and says, sometimes you can just check yes, but there's there. So this is something every merchant is supposed to fill out once a year with help from a qualified security assessor. So just wanted to show you that. We can jump to the next slide. So, merchant warehouse specifically, how does our security help? Where, we do things with protect cardholder data, P2P. I think this one might actually animate if we can jump one. Nope, guess not. So the overall idea here is, you've probably, if you're familiar with Merchant Warehouse, we talk about our Genius solution a lot and our middleware, and that we keep point of sale out of scope through P2P, point-to-point encryption and tokenization. And the overall idea here is, if you look at, the 6 bullets on the left that PCI governs, we're really only protecting the cardholder data. We're really only helping in that area. We're not making sure that merchants are doing background checks. We're just keeping that data secure through the transmission of the transaction. And that's a big thing because, if you do have a network vulnerability and someone hacks in to see something, it's much better that, it's much more secure that they see encrypted data, but, Merchant Warehouse's encryption on every card swipe doesn't prevent the cashier of writing down every card number that he sees, in which case, you're not PCI compliant, and that cashier may go do some fraud. So I just kind of wanted to lay the outline of security versus compliance there. So we kind of jump to the next slide. And so merchants are classified within PCI based on the overall transaction volume over a 12-month period, and they're classified into levels. So level 1 is the large merchant, 6 million merchant, 6 million transactions. These are the Targets, the Walmarts of the world, and they actually require a QSA to go on site every year to validate that, they're compliant within everything. And then if you want to scroll through the next few, I can get that. Level 2, 1 in 6 million million transactions. they need to have a QSA, and QSA actually has to fill out the annual compliance. Level 3, these are the e-com merchants. They just have to fill out an FAQ. And level 4, these are the small guys. Validation's recommended, but, compliance is overall required. So definitely recommend to all the merchants that, that they do this. So if you go to the next slide, really not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but the thing that I wanted to let you guys know is with PCI 2.0, there were 4 levels of FAQ. I think there might have been a 5th one. There might have been an addendum for something. With 3.0, there's going to be 9. And it's really just based on the merchant. So I kind of just put, instructions on there, but most of the merchants that you guys are going to run into will probably be using the FAQs, if I had to guess. But just wanted to give you that in there, just so that you guys would see and be able to refer to this. And just know that with PCI 3.0, they're making enhancements, and there's going to be 9 questionnaires that the merchants will have to choose from. So we can advance to the next one. So just to give you guys some ideas on what's happening with PCI compliance, PCI is sunsetting at the end of this year.
Ed, it sounds like we're not hearing you.
Yeah, I can't hear Ed anymore either. He suddenly cut off when you began this slide.
We are missing out Ed, and he was pointing out here the PCI 2.0 is sunset at the end of this year and good to the end of 15. I think I hear you now, Ed.
Yeah, I put myself on mute there. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, go right ahead.
So basically what I was saying, because I don't know exactly when I went on mute, is from the point a merchant files, that compliance statement is valid for a year. So if a merchant files today, they don't have to file for a PCI compliance again for another 12 months, so September of next year. And they can do that up until December 31st. Starting January 1st, they'll have to go to PCI 3.0 and the new rules. The other thing that's happening is there's some PCI PED changes as well. So now merchants that are taking PIN debit must upgrade to PIN pads that are at least meeting the PCI 1.0 standards. And if I had to guess, most merchants that are taking PIN are. That's been out there for about 4 or 5 years. So, but it's just time when they do the assessment, they should look at that. The other big thing to know is Windows XP is no longer PCI compliant. So any merchant using Windows XP is out of compliance right now. And the reason for that is earlier this year, Micros stopped supporting and releasing new upgrades and service packs for that. So that means that they're not regularly releasing updates and fixes for new vulnerability threats. And since that's required, merchants to install those regularly, it means that any merchant using XP is out of compliance. There's some good opportunities for upgrades right there. It's something I think people should be aware of. And I put in there that it's specifically under PCI DFS requirement 6.2, in case you guys want to be able to reference that. If you go to the next slide, and this is kind of where I go back to, compliance versus security. You can have a basic Windows 7 point of sale doing no encryption, no tokenization, and be compliant. You may do something dumb like or a merchant may do something dumb. None of us on the phone will ever do anything dumb. A merchant may do something dumb where they just put a sticky note on the hardware that just says this is the username and password, so that they're all not always remembering it, and that's not only not secure at all, it's not compliant. Now, if you're doing Windows XP with Genius, that Genius device is talking directly to Merchant Warehouse's gateway. It's using encryption and tokenization, so if someone were to hack the Windows XP system, they're not going to have the ability to decrypt. So it's actually still fairly secure, I could argue, but you're still not compliant because they're saying people can do data loggers or things like that. So, there's just always the give and take between, security and compliance. Just kind of wanted to make you guys aware. It's just something to think of there. So just jump into the next slide. And that's kind of what I wanted to point out, too, that, a P2P solution can still help with compliance. So this is specifically a part of the QSA, the annual FAQ that a merchant would have to file around protect cardholder data. And if you're saying my encrypted data from the MSR, you can start checking yes that say, yeah, we do this and reduce your overall time associated. Under PCI 2.0, if you were to have an industry standard encryption and tokenization, you could knock down the relevant questions you had to answer from about 288 to 88. So still very recommended, but there's more involved, more involved than just being compliant according to PCI. So if we jump to the next slide. Why PCI 3.0 now? And it's basically just PCI every 3 years. They go back, they look at the rules to say, are we meeting up with the latest and greatest threats that merchants may see? Do we need to recommend new best practices around passwords? Do we need to go to more advanced hardware with, tamper-resistant security modules? What are the emerging threats? How do we, what are the emerging threats? How do we evolve to protect ourselves? And then there's also just going back and clarifying existing rules based on questions and new technologies. So now I'm just going to start to go a little bit into what is new in PCI 3.0. It's not a lot, but these are the themes that drove it. It's basically get rid of weak passwords. We're seeing more third-party risks. QSAs, there was a lot of room for interpretation, and so it was really just try to make everything more of a shared responsibility so that we can better educate and make people aware and detect breaches and malware. So, jumping through to the next slide. This is my favorite one because this is big. Even though we wrote this is a big one in little letters, this is big. Rule 9.9 now says that merchants need to start taking an active stance on identifying where they accept payments, what hardware is used, and what steps they are taking to train their staff on how to look for tampering and potential fraud. So every year now, the merchant is going to have to answer questions that require them that's basically going to say, Mr. Merchant, could you please provide me an inventory of all devices you use to accept payment, including make, model, and some way to uniquely identify them, like a serial number. And then it's going to say, what have you done to physically inspect them on a regular basis? And regular basis is not defined, so like I said, PCI is a guideline, not always rules, to detect tamper intrusion or substitution. And what have you done to train employees to see if they see threats? So 3 new questions on the FAQ, but I'm pretty sure a lot of merchants aren't going to be prepared to answer that right now, if I had to bet. And like I said, this is where I go back. This is not my rule. This is PCI's rule. So jump into the next slide, some of the other things. That's what I think is the biggest one. Section 11 is, okay, you have a process to test your security systems and threat intrusion, but now they're saying, okay, can you give me a documented resolution if you need to make changes based on threats? Can you provide detail that your network segmentation works the way it's designed in IT configurations? And this is in the other top bullet there. I mean, how many merchants do you guys think can provide an inventory of their Wi-Fi networks in a building? I can't even give you a inventory of the Wi-Fi network I connect to on a daily basis. So. And then section 12 is where they're using outside service providers. They need to keep an inventory of that. It's what they do. Are they PCI compliant, and what level is the compliance? And basically a written contract that says the service provider and the merchant agrees on the service being performed and level of PCI compliance. So it's just a little bit more of, making the right people accountable for their actions and what they do. So you jump to the next slide. Where does this leave us? I think PCI 3.0 does a lot of good things. I really do. They fixed a lot of the language where, I kind of said that new regulation for 9 that says they should periodically look at the devices they use to accept for tamper intrusion and things like that. So they clarified a lot of the language from 2.0 to make things easier to understand. But with the new rules, there's still a lot of room for interpretation. I can't define should. I can't define periodic. I don't know if that means, 3 months, 6 months, 2 years. So as a merchant, they really want to be sure that they're working with a knowledgeable QSA. Merchant Warehouse specifically has arrangements with Control Scan, and this is just included within the overall service with Genius, where Control Scan can help them with their annual audit and walk them through the QSA. So, I think that's a good service. That's good to know, and we may be evolving that a little bit in the future, just based on some of these things that we're seeing. But, PCI does not address everything in 3.0. What about mobile? What about Apple's announcement yesterday where they're talking about, unique card numbers per transaction? And that means if someone gets a hold of that, it's really useless. So, what needs to be done behind that? And, knowing that they revisit this every 3 years and just all the advancements that we're seeing with phone payments, what's going to come next that this just doesn't address? So, it's just something to be aware of, that it's important, it's required, but it doesn't necessarily cover everything. And I think that's where we left off. So, happy to take any questions. Like I said, this deck will be given to you all, or can be distributed as a resource to help answer questions and inform merchants. But, by no means I'm not on the PCI committee. By no means consider this the Bible, and definitely advise merchants to consult with the QSA, or, in the instance of Merchant Warehouse, we can help them, put them in touch with Control Scan.
Thanks, Ed, for a lot of good information. Are there any questions? It's awfully quiet out there, but Ed, what do you think what's coming with EMV?
So, a lot of things, and there's going to be the overall liability shift. And if you look at, and the liability shift comes in October of 2015. And it's a little bit different for every card brand, but the idea is the card brand, Visa, MasterCard, and Amex, are going to shift liability to whoever is least ready to accept an EMV payment. So if as a consumer I have an EMV card to a merchant that's not ready for EMV, that merchant is going to accept the liability. If, an issuer issues me a MaxStripe card and then I use it at a EMV-enabled merchant, the card brand is going to shift the liability to the person who issued that card. Now, you got to realize the card brands only have relationships with, kind of the issuers and the processors and the merchants. So what we've seen in Canada is basically, the card brands are going to shift it off of them, but everyone else is just going to try to pass it on to someone else like a hot potato to just say, well, I was ready with my hardware, but Merchant Warehouse wasn't, and we'll be ready, so it's a bad example. But, it's not going to be as cut and dry as the rules are, is what I'm trying to say. And Visa and MasterCard just put out a joint press release maybe 3 weeks ago that said 550 million cards by the end of next year, 275 million by the end of this year, and 550 million is about 50% of the card issuance in the U.S. So I think we're going to start to see it faster and faster. And just know too that the chips that are going in phones like the Apple, that's using NFC technology that is based on a standard, and EMV can run on those phones in just the contactless manner. So you can also, tap a phone and generate an EMV transaction. Just be wary of that too.
And chip and PIN or chip and signature?
It will depend who you ask, but there's actually a lot that's going to happen in the next 3 weeks about consolidated testing and things like that. It's going to be the choice of the issuer. I think most of what you see in the U.S. is going to be chip and signature, just for the online transactions. And Visa's pushing that, MasterCard's pushing a little bit more PIN. But we're always going to have to be prepared for PIN in case the issuer sets it. And there could even be thresholds because the EMV chip allows for it, where it might just be signature under 200 and PIN above 200. So I think we need to be prepared for both, but I would assume a lot of it will be chip and signature.
All right. Well, again, thank you. Are there any last-minute questions? All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for attending this September 10th version of Keystroke Live. Next week, we will be demonstrating the Merchant Warehouse Genius that is EMV ready, right, Ed?
It is. Every hardware device we put out there has an EMV reader on it. All the processors, the First Data, the Chase Paymentechs of the world are kind of working on their EMV certification strategy for us. So not all of that is in place, but the idea is, you're not going to have to replace the hardware. You're not going to have to. It's going to be a software update, and it'll be done prior to liability shift. So we'll definitely be able to say, merchants are EMV ready, and they'll be able to accept the new Apple Pay, since NFC is built in as well.
Great, great. Well, thank you, everybody, for attending. If you have questions or if you want a copy of this presentation, just send me an email, and we will get it out to you. And Ed, thanks again. We appreciate the information.